So here's an example character, and we're going to really quickly rig up his torso and arms. I'm going to switch to the side view and start drawing in some bones. I'm using one very long bone to cover the majority of his torso. And I can adjust bones on the fly while I'm drawing them, which is kind of a nice feature. Alright, let me mirror this over to the other side. And now there's one more piece of information I need to give the deformer before I can go ahead and bind these joint chains to the mesh. And that is the approximate thickness of the mesh around each chain. This is something we'll have a nice interactive tool for doing when we have the release version, but in the meantime, I'm just going to go ahead and use a measure tool. I can just get that information and enter it into the right place. So that's one's like, maybe 9 if we want to sort of average it out a little bit. And this one's maybe, like 4-ish. Again, we don't have to be particularly accurate. We'll make these 4, and this one 9. Alright, now we're ready to bind. Now let's take a look at the deformation art produces. First of all, on the wrist. First of all, you'll note that I can bend this wrist around quite a lot and get very nice deformation. I haven't painted any weights or done anything else to modify the deformer. This is just what it does by default. Moreover, if I rotate the wrist bone on its axis, essentially twisting the mesh, you'll start getting this very nice automatic effect. Conventionally in rigging, you end up having to produce this propagation of twist up and down the arm by creating a whole bunch of extra influences, creating a whole rig to drive them, and painting a whole lot of extra weights. Here it's something done inherently in the deformer, and I haven't painted any weights at all. Now let's take a look at the elbow. Again, I'm getting very nice default deformation, and there are also a bunch of high-level controls for controlling how that deformation behaves. One of them, called volume gain, does exactly what you'd expect and controls the amount of volume that you're gaining inside the joint as it bends. You can also control spread, which affects how much the mesh is being spread away from any bend in this curve, which results in these really nice smooth curves on the interior of a bend that are very difficult to get through weight painting. Essentially impossible without additional influences through either linear blend or dual quaternion weighting. And we can also adjust the radius of the joint, which lets us control the overall bend, the smoothness of the bend locally. You may have noticed that I spoke about this joint chain as if it were a curve, and that's because that's exactly what it is. In art, bones really only exist to drive an underlying curve, and that's what's actually influencing the mesh. Just like any other curve, I can go in and add additional control points. This is what we call the bone CV, and I can add it to any bone in the rig at any time, including if it's a rig that has already been completed and referenced into a shot. If I'm an animator, I can decide to add more of these things as needed and get a great deal of control over how the mesh deforms. Let's take a look at this shoulder. If I rotate it downward, now we start to see some deformation that's clearly wrong. It's pushing in the chest in an unwanted way. But it's still holding its volume very nicely, and we'll be able to paint this away in a moment. One thing I did want to quickly show, though, was how the shoulder deforms when it twists. So here we're seeing a problem very common to rigs. You really need to propagate the twist up from the shoulder to the elbow, not have it all twisting here surrounding the shoulder joint itself. Normally, just like the wrist, I'd need to do this by adding a bunch of additional joints and doing a whole bunch of additional weight painting and a complex rig to control how they rotate. But in this case, I can use our feature called Inherit Twist. What this does is exactly what it sounds like. It is inheriting the twist from the previous joint in the chain, and then propagating it to the next. This gives you perfect shoulder twisting. So let's take a look at this unwanted deformation in the torso. Here's one case where we will use weight painting. But weight painting in art is quite different from conventional weight painting. Note that, for instance, this entire chain inside the spine is one single influence, and the same is true of each arm. This mesh literally has only 3 influences in its entirety. I'm just going to use conventional weight painting tools now to paint away some of the influence that the arm has on the torso. Allowing us to pretty easily fix these unwanted effects. If I parent both arm chains to the spine, I can very quickly create something very much like a Schleifer spine, or sometimes called an IK or spline spine. Note that the twisting I'm getting here is once again perfect and automatic. If I want even more control, I can go ahead and add a bone CV. Now I've got an incredibly controllable spline-based spine rig, and I made it literally while you were watching in, about 2 seconds. This is the sort of thing you'd normally need to do quite a bit of work to fully rig out, with both a curve that a bunch of joints would be following, the weight painting between the joints, and also figuring out how to propagate the twist properly between them. Art handles this all perfectly from the get-go. So here's the character fully rigged. I've got a couple of poses in here. This character's been rigged up in a very stretchy, broken rig kind of way, which is very easy to do with art. There's a couple of areas I want to take a look at. One of them is the head. So not every area of a mesh should bend and twist in the way that you would want a limb to, for instance. In the case of the head, if the twist was propagating through the chin, for instance, that wouldn't be right at all. So one of the abilities we have is the ability to paint a rigid influence. And that allows us to keep the deformation out of this whole head area. Now, one thing that is worth noting, though, is you still get a lot of the benefits of the art deformation. For instance, you'll note as I twist the head that the neck is twisting up to meet it very nicely. That's something we're getting for free with art. And that I can grab the head itself, and this, by the way, is not a separate control. It is literally just the bone that got created when we drew bones in for the head and the neck, and start moving it around like this, getting automatic deformation that behaves in a sort of broken rigging, stretchy sort of way. And that's something that you, again, I didn't really have to rig this up. This just sort of happened. This is what art bones do. You can also go ahead and rig them up if you want. In this case, for the arm, for instance, I do have a somewhat more complex rig that I'd set up. But fundamentally, you don't really need to do a whole lot to get that kind of deformation and that kind of rigging. Another area worth looking at is the fingers. Now, fingers often get short shrift when rigging because there are so many of them and they aren't always seen closely. And this sometimes causes problems. Let me stress that what these fingers are doing, the deformation that they are producing, cost me literally nothing to create. All I did was draw in the bone chains and do a little bit of weight painting to separate them. I did spend some time over the shoulder and the elbow, but I didn't spend any on the fingers, and yet I'm still getting excellent deformation, entirely for free. One last thing for this video. I'll show you some of Art's IK tools. I can grab any 3 joints, they don't even necessarily have to be in a hierarchical relationship, and apply IK to them. Now, Art IK does a lot of the usual things that you'd expect IK to do, but it also has a bunch of additional features built in. One of which is auto stretch. You automatically have auto stretch built into the IK handle. You don't need to actually go do anything to rig that up. In addition to that, we have smooth stretch. So if I turn that off, you can see some IK pop. Like right there, bang, it just pops into place. If I turn on smooth stretch, much like the Setup Machine 2, it will ease into that pop. It will ease into the straight position, thereby removing the IK pop. And we have some ability to control the stretching on each bone independently.